A sharp, jarring crack shattered the stillness of the late afternoon air, reverberating off the brick walls lining the quiet suburban street. Officer Batten's baton came down with brutal force, striking the boy's slender frame along his side. The impact sent him crashing to the pavement, his body crumpling like a rag doll tossed aside in a fit of anger. His backpack, heavy with textbooks and dog-eared notebooks from a long day at school, slipped from his shoulder and hit the ground with a dull thud, spilling its contents across the cracked asphalt. Pencils rolled into the gutter, a crumpled granola bar wrapper skittered in the breeze, and a worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird lay splayed open, its pages fluttering helplessly. The boy Jamal, just 13 years old, clutched his ribs, his gasps of pain piercing the air as he curled into himself, his face contorted in a mixture of shock and agony. His cries echoed down the block, raw and unfiltered, the sound of a child blindsided by a violence he couldn't comprehend. Around him, the street began to stir. A handful of onlookers emerged from their routinisms. Thompson, her watering can trembling in her wrinkled hands, a young mother pushing a stroller, her eyes wide with disbelief, a delivery driver pausing mid-stride, his clipboard forgotten. Their murmurs swelled into a chorus of outrage and confusion, a buzzing undercurrent that pulsed through the gathering crowd. "What's he done?" someone whispered. "He's just a kid." Another voice snapped, sharp with indignation. The air grew thick with tension, the weight of their collective anger pressing down like a storm cloud ready to burst. Jamal, still sprawled on the ground, felt the sting of gravel biting into his palms as he tried to push himself up, his breath shallow and ragged. Above him towered Officer Batten, his broad shoulders casting a shadow that swallowed the boy whole. The officer's face was a mask of cold authority, his jaw clenched as he barked accusations into the wind, claims of theft, of wrongdoing, each word flung without evidence, without hesitation, as if the boy's mere existence justified his suspicion. How had it come to this? The question gnawed at Jamal's mind as he lay there, the ache in his side pulsing with every heartbeat. Just moments ago, he'd been walking home from basketball practice, the familiar rhythm of his sneakers against the sidewalk a quiet comfort after a day of drills, and laughter with his teammates. The sun had dipped low, painting the sky in hues of orange and gold, and he'd been replaying the game in his head, how he'd sunk that final shot, the way his friends had cheered. It had been a good day, an ordinary day, until it wasn't. Now, the world felt upside down, twisted into something unrecognizable. Was it fear that drove the officer to lash out, a flicker of prejudice buried deep in his gaze? Or was it simply the unchecked power of a badge, the kind that warped justice into something cruel and arbitrary? Jamal's thoughts raced, his chest tightening with a mix of confusion and dread. He didn't understand it, the pain, not the accusations, not the way the officer loomed over him like a predator sizing up its prey. The crowd grew louder, their voices rising into a chaotic symphony of protest. Mrs. Thompson, her frail frame trembling with fury, stepped forward, her voice cutting through the din. "You leave that boy alone," she shouted, her words quivering but resolute. She'd known Jamal since he was a toddler wobbling down the street on a tricycle, his grin wide and fearless. To her, he was the kid who waved every morning, who'd once helped her carry groceries when her arthritis flared up. The idea that he could be a thief was absurd, an insult to the neighborhood she'd called home for decades. Beside her, the young mother clutched her stroller's handles, her knuckles white. She thought of her own son, barely 3, giggling in the park just yesterday. What if this happened to him one day? The thought sent a shiver down her spine, her anger simmering into something fiercer, more protective. Officer Batten barely flinched, his attention fixed on Jamal. "Get up," he snapped, his tone dripping with disdain. "Show me what's in that bag." Jamal's hands shook as he reached for his backpack, his fingers fumbling with the zipper. He wanted to scream that he hadn't done anything wrong, that he was just a kid heading home with his school books and a sweaty gym towel. But the words caught in his throat, trapped behind a wall of fear. He pulled out his books one by one, math, history, English, each title a quiet plea for reason. The officer's eyes narrowed, unimpressed, as if the evidence of Jamal's innocence only deepened his suspicion. "Kids like you," Batten muttered, the words laced with venom, always got something to hide. The scene might have ended there, a fleeting injustice swallowed by the rhythm of daily life. But the world had other plans. As the crowd pressed closer, phones emerged from pockets, their lenses glinting in the fading light. Videos began to spread, shaky footage capturing the boy's cries, the officer's towering figure, the spilled books scattered like casualties of a war no one had declared. Within hours, the storm broke wide open. Jamal's familiar's mother, a nurse who'd worked double shifts to keep them afloat, his father, a distant figure consumed by the weight of leading a nation, learned of the attack. His mother's hands trembled as she watched the clip, her exhaustion giving way to a fury that burned white-hot. She saw her son's crumpled form and felt a mother's terror, a mother's rage, a mother's vow to fight. His father, miles away in a sterile office, stared at the screen, his polished demeanor cracking as guilt and helplessness surged through him. He'd built a life to protect his family, yet here was his boy, broken on the pavement. What followed was a reckoning. Protests erupted, not just in Jamal's neighborhood but across the city, then the country. Signs waved in the air, justice for Jamal, and the abuse, as voices demanded answers the system couldn't provide. The officer's actions became a lightning rod, exposing the fragile line between power and tyranny. Jamal's family stood at the forefront, their grief and resolve fueling a movement that swelled with every passing day. His little sister, who'd laughed over cereal that morning, now clung to her mother's side at rallies, her wide eyes tracing the faces of strangers who chanted her brother's name. Mrs. Thompson joined them, her flower-watering days traded for picket lines, her quiet strength a testament to the community's resolve. Even the delivery driver, a man of few words, found himself speaking out, haunted by the memory of Jamal's crumpled form. This wasn't just about one boy anymore, it was about a world teetering on the edge of accountability. Jamal's pain became a mirror, reflecting the consequences of authority run amok, the price of justice denied. Each protest, each revelation, peeled back layers of a system that had grown too comfortable with its flaws. The lesson was stark and unyielding. Power, when wielded without restraint, didn't just bruise a child's body, it fractured trust, ignited fury, and demanded change. For Jamal, the road ahead stretched long and uncertain, his innocence forever altered by that single, brutal strike. But as his family fought, as the crowd grew, as the truth clawed its way into the light, one thing became clear: this story, born from a crack in the air, would echo far beyond that quiet street, a call to confront the shadows of power and build something better in their place. The air felt thick and oppressive, clinging to Jamal's skin as he stood rooted to the spot, his hands beginning to tremble despite his best efforts to stay calm. A clammy sheen of sweat coated his palms, and his breaths came in shallow, uneven gasps, each one a struggle against the rising tide of fear swelling inside him. What was happening? Why was this officer treating him like some kind of criminal? The question gnawed at him, looping through his mind with no answer in sight. The officer loomed before him, silent and unyielding, offering no explanation. His broad shoulders were squared, his posture rigid with tension, and his fingers twitched nervously near the holster strapped to his hip, a subtle but chilling sign of the danger simmering just beneath the surface. Jamal's heart pounded furiously in his chest, a frantic drumbeat that drowned out the distant hum of the city around him. The officer's gaze bore into him, heavy and unrelenting, like a physical weight pressing down on his shoulders. Every second that ticked by seemed to stretch the tension tighter, winding it into something volatile, something explosive. Jamal couldn't make sense of it. This encounter felt like it was spiraling into chaos. With no provocation, no reason he could grasp, every fiber of his being screamed at him to turn and run, to escape the suffocating pressure of the moment. But he knew that wasn't an option. Walking away wasn't just impractical, it was impossible. The officer's sharp, commanding tone had already made it clear: answers were demanded, and retreat was not tolerated. With deliberate care, Jamal forced his shaking hands to move slowly, determined not to give the officer any excuse to escalate things further. His fingers fumbled as he slid the straps of his backpack off his shoulders, the worn fabric brushing against his arms as he lowered it to the cracked pavement. The faint rasp of the zipper filled the silence as he opened it, his voice trembling but audible as he spoke. "I'll show you my phone," he said, the words barely rising above a whisper, fragile and unsteady. "I'll call my dad. He can explain everything." His chest tightened as he reached inside, his fingertips brushing the cool edge of the device. He just needed to connect with his father Samin, who could anchor him, someone who could make this nightmare make sense. But before he could even close his fingers around the phone, the officer's reaction erupted like a thunderclap. His eyes, wild with suspicion, locked onto Jamal's every twitch, every breath. The tension that had been coiling between them snapped, sharp and sudden, like a wire stretched beyond its limit. "Hands up," the officer barked, his voice cracking with a raw, panicked edge as he yanked his gun from its holster. "Get your hands up right now, or I'll shoot." The metallic click of the weapon being readied echoed in Jamal's ears, a sound so piercing it drowned out the world around him, the distant rumble of traffic, the faint chirping of birds, the hum of life that suddenly felt so far away. He froze, his fingers still grazing the phone, his mind reeling as terror surged through him. Everything was unraveling, slipping beyond his control, and he didn't know why. Fear pulsed through his veins, cold and electric, as the officer's shouted commands stabbed through the haze of his panic. "I'm not doing anything wrong," Jamal whispered, the words escaping his lips in a fragile, desperate plea. Slowly, he raised his hands, palms outward in a gesture of surrender, his backpack abandoned at his feet like a forgotten relic of a safer moment. His eyes darted to the officer's face, searching for some flicker of reason, some hint of mercy. But all he saw was a mask of taut suspicion. The gun remained steady, its barrel a dark, unblinking eye trained on him, turning every breath he took into a potential spark that could ignite the situation further. "I just want to call my dad," he said again, his voice quivering but fighting to hold steady. "Please, I'm just trying to call my dad. I'm not doing anything wrong." Officer Collins, though, seemed deaf to his words. His finger hovered over the trigger, tightening ever so slightly, his mind a storm of irrational dread. To him, Jamal's slow, careful movements weren't signs of compliance, they were threats, each one feeding the fear that clouded his judgment. Years of unchecked prejudice, of biases he'd never questioned, surged to the surface, drowning out any whisper of logic or empathy. In that fleeting, irreversible moment, his fear won. A single, deafening crack split the air as the gunshot rang out, the sound reverberating through the empty street with a force that seemed to fracture reality itself. Jamal's body jolted as the bullet tore through his leg, a searing, white-hot pain exploding from the point of impact. The force knocked him off balance, his knees buckling beneath him as he crumpled to the pavement. His breath caught in his throat, ragged and shallow, as the world tilted and blurred around him. The backpack lay forgotten a few feet away, its contents spilling slightly onto the ground. But it might as well have been miles away. All he could feel was the agonizing burn radiating from his leg, the thick, metallic taste of blood flooding his mouth as he bit down hard to stifle a scream. His hands instinctively flew to the wound, pressing against the torn fabric of his jeans. But the warmth of his own blood seeped through his fingers, pooling beneath him in a dark, glistening stain. His breaths came fast and uneven, a staccato rhythm that mirrored the wild thumping of his heart. Pain consumed him, overwhelming every thought, every sensation. But through the haze, his trembling, blood-slicked fingers scrabbled for the phone that had slipped from his grasp. The officer stood motionless, a blurred figure in Jamal's fading vision, his white eyes fixed on the boy he'd just shot. Colin's face was a mask of shock, as if he couldn't fully process the gravity of what he'd done. But Jamal barely registered him. All he could think about was reaching his father, his lifeline, his tether to survival. With a desperate, shaking hand, he snatched the phone from the pavement, his vision swimming as he pressed the call button. The faint vibration against his palm was a small victory, a spark of hope as the world dimmed around him. "Papa," he rasped, his voice a fragile thread barely audible over the roar of pain and panic in his head. "Papa." The call connected, and his father's voice broke through the fog, sharp and urgent. Jamal, what's wrong?" The sound was a lifeline, yanking him back from the brink as darkness crept into the edges of his sight. "I was going to school," Jamal choked out, the words fractured and heavy with the blood coating his tongue. "The police, they shot me." His grip on the phone faltered, his fingers growing numb as his strength ebbed away. His father's voice grew louder, frantic. "Jamal, where are you? Tell me where you are, son. Stay with me." It was a command, a plea, a thread of strength Jamal clung to with everything he had left. But the world was spinning, the pain in his legs swelling into something monstrous, and a bone-deep cold seeped into him despite the warm blood soaking his clothes. He tried to respond, to give his father the answers he needed, but his voice failed him, dissolving into a faint, broken whisper. The last thing he heard before the darkness swallowed him was his father's voice, calling his name with a desperate intensity, begging him to hold on. Then the world faded to black. When Jamal was rushed into the emergency room, the scene erupted into controlled chaos. Doctors and nurses swarmed around him, their movements swift and precise. A flurry of white coats and gloved hands under the harsh glare of fluorescent lights. The sterile glow cast stark shadows across the room, illuminating the pale sheen of Jamal's face as he lay on the stretcher, drifting in and out of consciousness. His leg, hastily wrapped in bandages, was a mess of blood-soaked fabric, the crimson stark against the white gauze. The pain had dulled to a persistent throb, a cruel reminder of the terror he'd endured. But it was the shock that gripped him tighter, disbelief, the confusion, the unanswered questions swirling in his mind. Why had the officer shot him? Why hadn't anyone listened? The clamor of the air buzzed around him, shouted orders, the beep of monitors, the crackle of a police radio in the distance, but it all felt muted, as if he were underwater. His pulse spiked as he caught fragments of a report over the radio, voices piecing together the incident, still searching for the truth. A truth no one yet knew. He was the president's son. Near the entrance, Officer Collins lingered, his face pale and drawn, a storm of confusion and dread churning behind his eyes. His hands rested on his hips, trembling faintly as he watched Jamal being wheeled away. The boy's blood still vivid on the pavement outside, a haunting stain he couldn't escape. His mind replayed the moment over and over, the boy reaching for his phone, the blinding panic that had seized him, the shot he'd fired without hesitation. He'd been so certain Jamal was a threat, so convinced in that split second. Now, staring at the aftermath, doubt gnawed at him, sharp and unrelenting. What had he done? The lesson here stretched far beyond that blood-streaked street. It was a brutal reminder of justice twisted by fear, of power wielded without restraint. Collins' unchecked biases had turned a routine encounter into a tragedy, leaving a boy fighting for his life and a father's voice echoing with helpless terror. The consequences of that single, reckless act rippled outward, a stark warning that authority, when corrupted by prejudice, could shatter lives in an instant. For Jamal, the pain was physical, but the deeper wound, betrayal of trust, the fragility of fairness, would linger long after the bandages came off. A suffocating wave of guilt crashed over Officer Collins, its force so overwhelming that his chest constricted painfully, as if an invisible hand were squeezing the breath from his lungs. The sterile, antiseptic-scented walls of the hospital seemed to inch closer with every passing second, trapping him in a shrinking cage of his own remorse. His gaze darted nervously down the dimly lit corridor, toward the chaotic hum of the emergency room where Jamal, a boy he'd irreversibly wronged, now lay fighting for his life. The burden of his actions pressed down on him like a leaden shroud, unbearable and unrelenting. He had fired his weapon at an innocent Sula young man, whose only crime was existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. Collins's mind spun in frantic circles, desperately grasping for some thread of justification, some shred of protocol he could cling to. But all that surfaced was the vivid image of Jamal's face, wide, terrified eyes glistening with unshed tears, hands trembling uncontrollably, a silent plea for mercy etched into his every feature. Collins squeezed his eyes shut, willing the memory to vanish, wishing he could erase the moment his finger tightened on the trigger. He wanted to convince himself he'd acted rightly, that he'd followed the rules drilled into him over years of training. Yet deep within, a gnawing truth clawed at his conscience. He had failed, catastrophically. Meanwhile, the hospital buzzed with restless energy as word of the shooting rippled through its halls. Nurses in crisp scrubs exchanged hushed whispers over clipboards. their voices tinged with disbelief and curiosity, while doctors paused mid-stride, their furrowed brows betraying the weight of the unfolding drama. The air grew thick with speculation as a single name began to circulate like wildfire. The president. Not just any president, but the man who had taken Jamal into his home, raised him with the tenderness of a father, and loved him as his own flesh and blood. The gravity of the situation crystallized with chilling clarity. This was no ordinary incident, no random tragedy to be swept under the rug. Even the officer stationed nearby, a lanky figure named Officer Daniels, who'd been idly twirling his pen moments earlier, now stood straighter, his jaw tightening as he overheard snippets of conversation. His sharp green eyes flicked toward Collins, a mix of pity and unease flickering across his face. Though he said nothing, Collins, oblivious to the growing storm, remained trapped in his own spiraling thoughts. He didn't yet grasp the full scope of his error that the boy he'd shot wasn't just another faceless teenager from the city's rougher edges, but the president's son. When that realization finally struck, it landed like a brutal fist to his stomach, knocking the air from his lungs and leaving him reeling. The atmosphere shifted abruptly as the president arrived, his entrance transforming the hospital into a tableau of taut nerves and stifled breaths. The temperature seemed to plummet, the air growing dense with unspoken tension. Collins stood rigid, his pulse hammering in his ears, the weight of his mistake settling into his gut like a cold, immovable stone. His legs trembled beneath him, threatening to buckle, while his shallow breaths barely sustained him. Fear rooted him to the spot, a paralyzing force that rendered his body useless. He had shot the president, sown a mistake so monumental it defied comprehension, and now there was no undoing it. The president swept into the room, his presence a commanding force that demanded attention without effort. His face was an unreadable mask, chiseled and stern, his eyes glinting with a cold, calculating intensity that sent a shiver down Collins's spine. Every step he took echoed through the tiled halls, a steady, purposeful rhythm that seemed to count down to an inevitable reckoning. As the president's gaze landed on him, Collins's throat constricted, the air around him thickening until it felt like he was drowning. He couldn't lift his eyes to meet that piercing stare. Shame pinned him in place, a prisoner of his own making, as the enormity of his actions loomed larger with every heartbeat. Beyond the hospital's walls, the president's journey had begun in a haze of anguish and urgency. In his office, he'd stood clutching the phone, his knuckles whitening as he gripped it with desperate strength. His chest heaved with barely contained panic, each breath laced with dread. Jamal's voice haunted him, a fragile whisper replaying endlessly in his mind. "Papa, they shot me." The tremor in those words, the raw terror woven into them, sent a surge of ice through his veins, chilling him to his core. Fear rose bitter and sharp in his throat, a taste he couldn't swallow. This wasn't just another tragedy reported on the evening news, not another statistic to lament and forget. This was his son, the boy he'd vowed to protect, the child he'd raised with every ounce of his heart. The president lurched to his feet, his chair scraping across the polished floor with a jarring screech that shattered the silence of his office. His mind raced, a chaotic whirlwind of questions and fury, but his body moved on instinct. He was a man of immense power, a leader who shaped nations, yet in that moment, he was simply a father, helpless, vulnerable, and consumed by terror. "Get me to the hospital now," he barked, his voice a blade honed by urgency and a simmering rage he'd kept buried for years. The car tore through the city streets, its sirens piercing the night with an insistent wail. Inside, the president sat rigid, his fists clenched so tightly his nails dug into his palms. His thoughts churned relentlessly. What had happened? Why Jamal? Had it been a cruel twist of fate? A case of wrong place, wrong time? No, he decided, his jaw tightening. This was no accident. His son had been targeted, singled out, and the officer responsible would answer for it. The driver wove expertly through the snarl of traffic, tires squealing against asphalt. But to the president, every second stretched into an agonizing eternity. Jamal's face flickered in his mind, pale, frightened, those trusting eyes now clouded with pain. His son, shot by a man who'd had no cause to fear him, no reason to assume the worst. The officer had seen Jamal's skin, his youth, and let bias pull the trigger. The president's hands balled tighter, his restraint fraying as grief and fury battled within him. Beneath the storm of emotions, one truth anchored him. He would move heaven and earth to ensure Jamal's safety and justice. When the car screeched to a halt at the emergency room entrance, the doors swung open as if on cue, revealing a cluster of medical staff poised and waiting. The president stepped out, and the air itself seemed to shift, bowing to the weight of his rival. His presence was unmistakably a towering figure radiating authority and resolve. The hospital staff parted like a tide, their movements swift and deferential, clearing a path for the man whose son lay within. Word had spread like wildfire. The president was here, and the reason was no mystery. His sharp gaze swept the room, landing on Officer Collins, who stood hunched in the far corner, his trembling hands betraying his unraveling composure. The president didn't need confirmation. He knew instinctively this was the man who'd pulled the trigger. The officer's fear was palpable, a thick, heavy thing that hung in the air between them. The president's voice sliced through the silence, low and unyielding. "Where is my son?" The staff scrambled to comply, some casting furtive glances, others hurrying to lead him down the corridor. His steps were deliberate, each one a testament to his determination, though his heart thundered with dread. At the door to Jamal's room, the president paused, his hand resting on the cool metal handle. He steeled himself, drawing a ragged breath as he braced for the sight within. Pushing the door open, he stepped inside, and the world narrowed to the figure on the bed. Jamal lay motionless, his skin ashen against the stark white sheets, tubes snaking from his arms to a chorus of beeping machines. His leg, swathed in bandages, bore dark stains of blood seeping through, a brutal testament to the violence he'd endured. But it was the silence that struck hardest, a hollow, unnatural stillness that gripped the room and squeezed the president's chest until he could scarcely breathe. His son looked so small, so fragile, a shadow of the vibrant boy he'd raised. The sight fractured something deep within him, a crack that threatened to split him apart. He wanted to rush forward, to gather Jamal in his arms, to whisper promises of safety and love. But he held back, rooted by the grim reality before him. This wasn't just a wound to heal. It was a wound inflicted by a deeper sickness, prejudice, fear, and the abuse of power. As the president stood over his son, resolve hardened within him. Justice wasn't just a word, it was a necessity, a reckoning for those who wielded authority without care. Officer Collins's mistake had exposed a fault line, a reminder that power unchecked could shatter lives. The president vowed silently that this would not be buried, that the consequences would ripple far beyond this room. For Jamal, for every child judged quickly, he would fight. The lesson was clear: when power forgets its purpose, it becomes a weapon, and justice must rise to meet it. In the sterile, frigid air of the hospital room, the president stood like a sentinel beside his son. Jamal, his heart pounding with a chaotic mix of dread and fury. His mind churned relentlessly, a storm of questions swirling within him. How had everything spiraled so violently out of control? What chain of events had transformed his bright, innocent boy into a victim? Lying pale and fragile on this unforgiving bed, the hum of the machines monitoring Jamal's shallow breaths buzzed in the background, a cruel reminder of the fragility of life, a life now hanging in the balance because of someone else's reckless choice. Every glance at his son's still face deepened the lines of anguish etched across his brow, each second amplifying the unbearable weight of this moment. His fists clenched involuntarily as he wrestled with the betrayal gnawing at his soul. His son, the child he'd nurtured and shielded, had been struck down by the very system meant to safeguard him. The president's chest tightened with a simmering rage, but beneath it lay a profound sorrow, a heavy ache that refused to relent. Jamal's slow, labored breathing offered a flicker of hope amidst the wreckage, yet it couldn't erase the stark reality. This was only the beginning. The road ahead loomed long and treacherous, filled with questions no one could fully answer, pain no words could soothe, and an aftermath that would test them all. He wondered, with a pang of dread, if Jamal, his brave, resilient boy, could endure what was to come. But the deeper question gnawed at him: was the world ready to confront the ugly truths this tragedy laid bare? The lessons of justice, The consequences of unchecked power, would they resonate? Or would they be drowned out by apathy? The silence shattered with a timid knock, the sound slicing through the room's oppressive stillness like a hesitant plea. The door creaked open slowly, its hinges groaning as if reluctant to reveal what lay beyond. Officer Collins stepped inside, his presence tentative, his uniform a symbol once of authority hanging on him like a tattered shroud. His gaunt face was drained of color, his eyes sunken and shadowed, darting nervously as though he feared the very walls might collapse upon him. His hands trembled at his sides, fingers twitching with the restless energy of a man haunted by his own actions. He moved with the halting steps of someone approaching a guillotine, each footfall echoing with the weight of his guilt. The room seemed to shrink around him, the air thickening with a fog of shame and regret that clung to both men, inescapable and suffocating. The president's gaze locked onto Collins without a flicker of hesitation, his expression an impenetrable mask of ice. There was no warmth, no mercy, only a steely resolve forged by a father's love and a leader's outrage. Collins stopped a few paces away, his body rigid, his breath coming in shallow, uneven gasps. The tension between them crackled like a live wire, the unspoken accusation hanging heavy in the air. "You're the officer who shot my son," the president said, his voice steady but laced with a razor-sharp edge. The words reverberated in the small space, each syllable dripping with restrained fury, betrayal, and a fierce determination that seemed to pierce straight through Collins' fragile defenses. Collins nodded, a slow, jerky motion, his face paling further until he looked almost ghostly. His hands shook violently now, dangling uselessly at his sides as if they, too, were ashamed of what they'd done. He opened his mouth, lips quivering, but the words refused to come. The enormity of his mistake crashed over him like a tidal wave, drowning him in its depths. He'd acted in a split second out of fear, out of instinct, but that fleeting choice had been catastrophically wrong. His mind replayed the moment endlessly, the dark street, the sudden movement, the panic that had seized him. He'd seen Jamal, a young black boy, and in that heartbeat, his training had failed him. His biases had taken over, whispering lies his gun had turned into truth. "Tu didn't know," he stammered at last, his voice cracking like brittle glass. "I didn't know he was your son. I thought he was reaching for something dangerous. I thought." His words faltered, dissolving into the air, unfinished and feeble against the magnitude of his error. The president's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening as he took a deliberate step forward. Collins flinched, a reflex born of guilt, but the president's stare remained unyielding, cutting through the officer like a blade. "You saw a young black boy and assumed he was a threat," he said, his voice low and frigid, each word echoing with a chilling clarity that filled the room. "You judged him by the color of his skin, by the way he looked, and because of that, you pulled the trigger." The accusation landed like a physical blow, and Collins' head bowed lower, his shoulders slumping under the crushing weight of the truth. He couldn't deny it, wouldn't dare try. The shame burned through him, a fire stoked by the realization that his fears, his prejudices, had cost an innocent boy his safety, his future. "Tu didn't mean to," Collins choked out, his voice barely above a whisper as tears glistened in his eyes. His body trembled, racked by sobs he could no longer suppress, his mind scrambling to grasp the full scope of his actions. He'd been a protector ancier, so he'd believed. Years on the force, training for high-stakes moments, had taught him to trust his gut. But that night, his gut had betrayed him, twisted by shadows he hadn't even known he carried. Now, standing before the president, he felt stripped bare, every pretense of authority torn away. The president advanced again, his presence towering, his expression hardening into something almost unrecognizable. "Sorry doesn't undo what you've done," he said, his tone a deadly calm that belied the storm raging within. "You took an oath to protect and serve, but today, you've proven you're incapable of either." Collins squeezed his eyes shut, the words slamming into him with merciless force. The hospital room's sterile chill seemed to seep into his bones, the hum of Jamal's machines a relentless accusation. He had no defense, no shield against the reality of his failure. The badge on his chest felt like a brand now, marking him not as a guardian, but as a man who'd shattered a family. He thought of his own life, his wife waiting at home. His young daughter who idolized Hyman wondered how he'd ever face them again. How could he explain that he'd let fear rule him? That he'd destroyed a boy's life because he hadn't paused, hadn't questioned? The president turned back to Jamal, his gaze softening for a fleeting moment as it rested on his son's face. The boy's chest rose and fell in a fragile rhythm, each breath a quiet defiance against the violence that had brought him here. The sight fueled the president's resolve, stoking the fire of a father's love and a leader's duty. He'd spent years fighting for justice, for a world where his son could thrive without fear. Yet here they were, ensnared in a nightmare born of the very injustices he'd sworn to dismantle. The betrayal cut deeper than any bullet his son, targeted not for what he'd done, but for who he was. Another soft creak of the door announced Collins' return, though he'd barely left the president's sight. This time, he seemed smaller, diminished, his uniform sagging as if it no longer fit the man he'd been. His hands shook uncontrollably as he stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the floor. Unable to meet the president's piercing stare, the guilt consumed him now, a living thing gnawing at his insides. Every step felt like wading through quicksand, every breath a struggle against the suffocating weight of his remorse. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, his voice raw and broken. "I never meant to hurt him. I thought he was reaching for something. He was just trying to do my job." The president's head snapped up, his eyes blazing with a cold fury that stopped Collins in his tracks. "Your job," he repeated, the words laced with venomous scorn. "Your job is to protect, not to shoot first and ask questions later. Your job isn't to let fear and prejudice guide your hand. You saw my son, and in an instant, you decided he was guilty because of his skin." His voice rose, sharp and unrelenting, slicing through the room's thick tension. "You acted on suspicion, on cowardice, and now we're all here, picking up the pieces of your failure." Collins' mouth opened, but no sound emerged. The reality bore down on him, relentless and unyielding. How had he let it come to this? He remembered the night in vivid fragments, the dim streetlights casting long shadows, the adrenaline surging through him, the split-second decision that had felt so right in the moment. But it hadn't been right. It had been a lie, born of biases he'd never confronted, fears he'd never questioned. He'd seen Jamal's hands move, and instead of caution, he'd chosen violence. Now, a boy lay wounded, a father stood broken, and Collins' world crumbled beneath the weight of his own making. The president stepped closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, each word deliberate and searing. "You don't get to make those calls with my son. Not with anyone's child. What you did was reckless, thoughtless. You hurt my family. You scarred a boy who'd done nothing to deserve it." Collins' face flushed crimson, his shoulders sagging further as the president's words stripped away the last of his defenses. He'd been trained for chaos, for danger, but nothing had prepared him for this, the raw, human cost of his mistake, the cold truth that he'd let prejudice pull the trigger. "To thought I was doing the right thing," Collins murmured, his voice a fragile thread on the verge of snapping. "I thought he was a threat. I didn't know." The president cut him off, his eyes flashing with a fury tempered by exhaustion. "You didn't know because you didn't care to find out. You didn't give him a chance, didn't hesitate long enough to see the truth. You assumed, you acted, and now we all bear the consequences." His gaze bore into Collins, unblinking and merciless. "That's the problem, officer. You never stopped to think. You let fear and ignorance decide. And my son paid the price." Collins stood frozen, his head bowed in utter defeat. He couldn't lift his eyes, couldn't face the man whose world he'd shattered. The lesson was clear, carved into his soul with brutal precision. Justice demanded more than instinct, more than power. It required restraint, humanity, qualities he'd failed to summon when it mattered most. The consequences of his abuse of authority rippled outward, a stark warning etched in the pain of a father and the fragility of a wounded boy. As the president turned back to Jamal, Collins remained rooted in place, a broken figure drowning in the wreckage of his own choices, the weight of justice pressing down with an unrelenting force he could never escape. The air in the hospital room hung heavy, thick with an oppressive stillness that seemed to cling to every surface. The sterile white walls, gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights, closed in around Jamal, A boy whose fragile frame lay motionless beneath the crisp sheets of the bed. The steady, mechanical beep of the heart monitor punctuated the silence, a cruel reminder of the life teetering on the edge. Every so often, the faint shuffle of a nurse's footsteps echoed down the hall, a fleeting intrusion into the suffocating quiet that otherwise dominated the space. But it was the silence between those sounds vast, unbearable void that carried the real weight. It was a silence filled with unspoken anguish, with questions that clawed at the mind, with emotions too raw and jagged to be shaped into words. Jamal's body bore the marks of trauma, bullet wound that seared through his leg, a constant, throbbing agony that pulsed with every shallow breath he took. The pain was relentless, a fire that flared whenever he dared to shift even slightly, threatening to rip a scream from his throat. But beneath the physical torment lay something far more excruciating, a wound no bandage could mend. His mind churned with chouse flashes of that fateful moment replaying in an endless, tortuous loop. He could still see Officer Collins' face, cold and unyielding, eyes narrowed with a suspicion that had no basis in reality. He could feel the icy grip of terror that had seized him as the officer's hand moved to his holster, the deafening crack of the gunshot that followed, the way his own pleas desperate, frantic had dissolved into the air, unheard and unheeded. In those fleeting seconds, Jamal had understood something devastating to this man. He was not a 14-year-old boy with a backpack slung over his shoulder, heading to school with dreams tucked in his heart. He was a threat, a shadow cast by the color of his skin, a figure reduced to a stereotype in the blink of an eye. That realization gnawed at him now, a deep, aching scar that no medicine could touch. The betrayal stung worse than the bullet's trust in the world, in the people meant to protect him, had been shattered in an instant. He'd always known the stories, heard the whispers from his parents, his friends, about the way the system could turn on you. But to feel it'll live, it was a different kind of pain, one that sank into his bones and threatened to hollow him out. His spirit fought to hold on, clinging to the fragments of who he'd been before that moment. But the weight of it all pressed down relentlessly. Beside the bed, the president sat in a stiff hospital chair, his broad shoulders hunched under the burden of his own torment. His eyes, usually sharp and commanding, were fixed on his son with a tenderness that belied the storm raging within him. One hand rested gently on Jamal's uninjured leg, his thumb tracing slow, soothing circles over the thin blanket, as if the motion could somehow anchor them both. He didn't speak, didn't dare break the fragile quiet, but his mind was a tempest of grief and fury. He'd seen the news vans gathering outside, heard the murmur of aides discussing statements and strategies, but none of it mattered, not now. His only son lay before him, broken and fighting, and the weight of that reality eclipsed everything else. He thought of Jamal's laughter, the way it used to fill their home, the bright spark in his eyes when he talked about his future dreams of college, of making a difference. Now, those dreams hung in the balance, and the president's heart twisted with a helplessness he'd never known. Outside, the sky darkened with heavy clouds, a mirror to the turmoil brewing within him. He knew this wasn't just about Jamalnet anymore. His son's story was already rippling outward, a spark igniting a fire that would demand answers, accountability, justice. The world would watch, judge, and weigh his every move. But he couldn't think of politics now. All he wanted was for Jamal to open his eyes, to see that spark again, to know his boy would heal not just in body, but in soul. Yet even as he clung to that hope, a resolve hardened within him. This couldn't be ignored, couldn't be buried beneath platitudes or excuses. What had happened to Jamal was a thread in a larger tapestry of pain, woven from years of prejudice and broken trust, and it demanded to be confronted. The door creaked open, a soft sound that sliced through the tension like a blade. Two hospital staff members stepped inside, their faces tight with unease, followed by a figure who seemed to shrink beneath the weight of his own presence, Officer Collins. His uniform, once a badge of authority, now hung on him like a shroud, the fabric wrinkled and sagging as if it, too, bore the shame of his actions. His face was pale, almost ghostly, the lines around his eyes and mouth etched deeper by exhaustion and guilt. He moved with the hesitance of a man walking to his own reckoning, his steps slow and deliberate, each one a struggle against the invisible chains that bound him. Behind him, a security guard lingered, a silent sentinel ensuring he faced what he'd done. Collins stopped just inside the doorway, his breath catching as his gaze flickered to the bed. Jamal lay there, still unconscious, a fragile figure swallowed by the machinery that kept him alive. Then his eyes darted to the president, and the air seemed to thicken with the weight of that meeting. The president rose slowly, the chair scraping against the tile with a harsh, grating sound that echoed in the stillness. His presence filled the room, towering and unyielding, yet his voice, when it came, was low and measured, each word a carefully aimed arrow. "Officer Collins," he began, his tone steady but laced with a quiet fury. "Do you understand why you're here?" Collins' throat bobbed as he swallowed, the dryness making his voice crack when he finally spoke. "To know, sir," he stammered, his hands trembling at his sides. "I know what I did. I didn't mean for this to happen. I thought he was reaching for something dangerous. I thought he was a threat." The words tumbled out, weak and faltering, a flimsy shield against the truth he couldn't escape. The president's gaze didn't waver, his eyes glinting like polished steel, cold and unrelenting. "A threat," he repeated, his voice rising just enough to sharpen the edge of his composure. "A 14-year-old boy, walking to school, reaching for his phone to call Meadow, ask his father for help. Tell me, Officer Collins, what was so dangerous about that?" The question hung in the air, heavy and accusing, stripping away any pretense Collins might have clung to. The officer's knees seemed to buckle slightly, his body rigid with the effort to hold himself together. His mind raced, a chaotic swirl of regret and self-recrimination. How had it come to this? How had he let irrational fear cloud his judgment so completely? He'd seen Jamal that morning, a boy in a hoodie with a backpack, and in an instant, his training, his biases, his assumptions had painted a picture that wasn't real. He'd acted, pulled the trigger, and now the consequences stared back at him in the form of a wounded child, and a father's righteous anger. "I didn't know," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I thought I was doing my job. I thought he seemed sorry. I didn't mean to." The president cut him off, stepping closer, his shadow falling over Collins like a storm cloud. "You didn't mean to," he said, his voice dangerously soft, each syllable dripping with restrained rage. "You didn't mean to shoot my son. You didn't mean to rob a child of his future, his safety, his trust in the world. You didn't mean to abuse the power you were given, to turn it into a weapon against an innocent boy." He paused, letting the words sink in, watching as Collins shrank further, his head bowing under the weight of his shame. "I didn't mean to hurt him," Collins murmured, barely audible, his eyes fixed on the floor. "I'm so sorry," but the apology felt empty, a hollow echo in a room filled with the wreckage of his actions. He knew it changed nothing. The damage was Donna Jamal's pain, the president's grief. The nation's outrage of it stemmed from a single, irreversible moment of weakness. The president stepped back, his chest rising and falling with a deep, steadying breath. "Your sorrow doesn't undo what you've done," he said, his voice firm now, resolute. "You will face the consequences. You will answer for this not just to me, but to the law, to the people, to every child who's ever been judged and punished for the way they look. This isn't just about Jamal. It's about a system that let you believe you could act without thought, without humanity, and I will see to it that justice is served." Collins nodded, a small, broken gesture, his voice lost to him. The room fell silent again. But it was a different kind of quiet now, charged with the promise of reckoning. For Jamal, for his father, for every soul touched by this tragedy. The lesson was clear: power unchecked breeds suffering, and justice, though slow, would not be denied. The air in the hospital room hung heavy with tension. As the president stepped closer to Officer Collins, his piercing gaze cutting through the sterile silence, his eyes, cold and resolute, bore into the trembling figure before him, a man whose badge had once symbolized protection, but now reeked of betrayal. "Sorry doesn't erase the damage you've inflicted," the president said, his voice steady, each word dripping with the weight of a father's anguish. "Sorry doesn't soothe the ache my son carries in his heart, nor does it rebuild the fragile trust you shattered when you marked him as a danger, without a shred of reason." The lesson here was stark and unforgiving. Justice demands accountability, and the misuse of power leaves scars that apologies alone cannot heal. Officer Collins stood rooted to the spot, his chest constricting as if an invisible hand were squeezing the life out of him. His eyes glistened with unshed tears, the sting of guilt clawing at his insides. I understand," he whispered, his voice barely audible, cracking under the strain of his remorse. "I see it now, clear as day. Never should have done it. I never should have let my fear pull that trigger." His hands twitched at his sides, longing to undo the moment that had spiraled beyond his control. But the past remained an unyielding wall he couldn't breach. The president's expression softened for a fleeting second, a flicker of humanity breaking through his iron resolve. Yet his tone retained its unshakable edge. "You'll face the consequences, Officer Collins, swiftly. No one escapes the law, not even those who wield it. Your actions have lit a fire, and you'll feel its burn." With that, the president turned away, his broad shoulders sagging slightly as he crossed the room to where his son, Jamal, lay. The hospital bed creaked faintly under the boy's weight, its white sheets stark against his skin, still cool to the touch. Reaching out, the president's hand trembled as it closed around Jamal's, his fingers brushing gently against the boy's knuckles, seeking a connection amidst the chaos. His heart thudded painfully in his chest, a storm of love and fury warring within him as he stood vigil over his child. The antiseptic scent of the room mingled with the faint metallic tang of medical equipment, a constant reminder of the fragility of life and the brutality that had brought them here. The door swung open with a soft hiss, and the doctor stepped in, his presence slicing through the thick atmosphere like a blade. "Mr. President," he began, his voice calm and measured, carrying the respectful neutrality of someone accustomed to delivering life-altering news. "We've stabilized him. He's awake now, not fully out of danger, but the worst is behind us for the moment." Relief washed over the president's face, softening the hard lines etched by sleepless nights and unspoken fears. He nodded, his grip tightening ever so slightly on Jamal's hand as the boy's fingers stirred, a faint squeeze signaling the return of his strength. Leaning down, the president brushed a stray lock of hair from Jamal's forehead, his touch tender yet burdened with the emotions he'd fought to contain. As Jamal's eyes fluttered open, bleary and searching, his father's voice emerged low and warm, brimming with a love that refused to break. "You're going to pull through, son. We'll face this together, step by step." Jamal's gaze locked onto his father's, his breath shallow but steady. "I'm sorry, Dad," he rasped, his voice a fragile thread woven with guilt. "I didn't mean to stir up all this mess." The president's lips curved into a gentle smile, and he shook his head, dismissing the apology with a quiet strength. "Don't you dare apologize, son. You did nothing wrong, just heading to school, living your life. The fault isn't yours to carry." Jamal managed a faint smile in return, his eyelids drooping as exhaustion tugged him back into sleep's embrace. But in that fleeting exchange, the president glimpsed something profound. This wasn't merely about mending a broken body. It was about igniting a transformation, a ripple that would stretch far beyond these hospital walls, beyond their family, to challenge a society too long complacent in its flaws. Days bled into weeks, and the hospital room began to shed its oppressive gloom. The incessant beeping of monitors, once a grim soundtrack to their despair, softened into a steady rhythm of hope. Jamal's breathing grew stronger, each inhale a testament to his resilience, replacing the ragged gasps that had haunted his father's every waking moment. The road to recovery stretched out before them, a winding path marked by setbacks and small victories, but it was no longer shrouded in hopelessness. The physical pain, though still a cruel echo of that fateful day, dulled under the meticulous care of the medical team, the unwavering devotion of his family, and the quiet persistence of time. Yet beneath the surface, deeper wounds festered no bandage could cover, no doctor could stitch shut. For Jamal, healing was a battle fought on two fronts. The bullet had torn through his leg, leaving a jagged scar that would fade with years. But the terror of that moment, the deafening crack of the gunshot, the cold steel of Officer Collins' pistol trained on him without cause carved a wound into his soul. Night after night, he jolted awake, sweat-soaked and trembling, the echo of that shot ringing in his ears. The image of Colin's unyielding stance burned into his mind. The nightmares might one day grow faint, but the fear, the bewilderment, the betrayal wove themselves into the fabric of who he was. A silent burden he'd carry into an uncertain future. Justice, he learned, was a double-edged sword. It could punish the guilty, but it couldn't erase the innocence stolen from the wronged. Through it all, his father remained a rock, an unshakable pillar in a world that had crumbled beneath Jamal's feet. The president sat by his bedside, his presence a balm against the darkness, his hand a lifeline when the memories pressed too close. But even he wrestled with his own tempest. Each glance at his son's fragile form fueled a growing fire within him, a resolve to turn this pain into purpose. Jamal's quiet courageous refusal to let fear silence him stirred something deep in the president's chest, a reminder that this fight wasn't just personal. It was a clarion call for a nation teetering on the edge of reckoning. The doctor, a man named Dr. Ellis, became a steady figure in their lives, his calm demeanor a counterpoint to the chaos they'd endured. With his wire-rimmed glasses perched on a weathered face, he carried the quiet authority of someone who'd seen too many tragedies yet clung to hope. He'd linger after his rounds, sharing small stories of other patients who'd defied the odds, offering Jamal a smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "You're a fighter," he'd say, his voice soft but firm, and those words planted seeds of strength in the boy's battered spirit. Beyond the hospital, the incident rippled outward, a stone cast into a still pond. The president knew Jamal's story wasn't unique unless others bore the same invisible scars, victims of a system that too often judged by color rather than character. Officer Colin's split-second decision, driven by prejudice rather than evidence, wasn't an anomaly. It was a symptom of a rot that had festered unchecked. As Jamal's body mended, his voice emerged, tentative at first, then rising with a clarity that cut through the noise. He spoke of the fear that shadowed his every step that day, the sting of being reduced to a threat for no reason but his skin. His words, raw and unfiltered, carried the weight of truth, resonating with those who'd walked the same treacherous path. The president listened, his heart swelling with pride and sorrow, and he knew this was bigger than their family's struggle. The nation stood at a crossroads, its fractures laid bare by a single bullet. He threw himself into the fray, his voice booming across podiums and airwaves, demanding reforms laws to curb racial profiling, training to teach officers restraint, transparency to hold power accountable. The backlash was fierce. Skeptics sneered, insisting the system was fine, that Jamal's pain was a fluke. But the president stood tall, his son's resilience fueling his fight, knowing that justice delayed was justice denied. In the months that followed, the movement swelled. Protests thundered through city streets, a chorus of voice black, white, young, old crying out for equity. Jamal, still hobbling on crutches, found his place among them, his quiet resolve blossoming into a beacon. He spoke to crowds, to kids like him, his words a lifeline for those who'd been silenced too long. The consequences of unchecked power had nearly claimed his life, but from that wreckage, he forged a legacy that promised a reckoning, a chance to rebuild a world where no child would fear the very hands meant to protect them. In the depths of his hospital room, Jamal lay surrounded by the antiseptic scent of sterile white walls, a stark contrast to the vibrant life he once knew. The days stretched endlessly before him, each one a battle against the searing pain that coursed through his body, and the haunting echoes of that fateful encounter. His chest bore the mark of a bullet, a jagged scar that told a story of survival, a permanent reminder of the terror that had upended his world. Yet, as the physical agony began to ebb with each sunrise, the invisible wounds carved deep into his soul refused to fade so easily. Every time he shut his eyes, the scene replayed with merciless clarity. Officer Colin's cold, unyielding gaze locking onto him, the glint of the gun barrel catching the dim streetlight, and the harsh bark of commands that stripped away his sense of safety. Helplessness had wrapped around him like a suffocating shroud, and though his body was mending, his spirit wrestled with the ghosts of that day, desperate to reclaim the boy he used to be. Across town, Officer Collins sat alone in the dim glow of his sparsely furnished apartment, the weight of his actions pressing down on him like an unrelenting storm. Dismissed from the force, his badge and gun stripped away, he was a man unmoored, adrift in a sea of regret. The official consequences were severe, but they paled in comparison to the torment that gnawed at his conscience. He replayed the moment, endless lithe split-second decision, the pull of the trigger, the sight of Jamal crumpling to the ground. Collins had always seen himself as a protector, a guardian of order, but now he couldn't escape the truth. He had become the threat. No apology could erase the pain he'd inflicted. No amount of remorse could stitch together the lives he'd torn apart. Jamal's suffering, his family's anguish, it clung to Collins like a shadow, a burden he knew he'd carry until his last breath. Justice, he realized, wasn't just a system, it was a mirror. And what it reflected back at him was a man he could no longer recognize. Jamal's father, the president, stood as a pillar of strength amid the chaos, his broad shoulders bearing the dual weight of a grieving parent and a leader under scrutiny. In the quiet moments, when the cameras were off and the world wasn't watching, he sat by his son's bedside, his hand gripping Jamal's with a fierceness that belied his calm exterior. His voice, steady and deep, carried promises of love and unwavering support, but beneath it churned a tempest of fury and sorrow. He'd spent his life fighting for a nation, believing in its potential for greatness. Yet here was his own child, a casualty of its failures. Each night, as he addressed the country from the grand podium of power, his words were laced with a father's desperation and a leader's resolve. He spoke of systemic rot, of a justice system that had betrayed his son and countless others, his eyes burning with a determination to turn his personal pain into a national awakening. For him, this wasn't just about Jamal, it was about every child who'd been silenced, every parent who'd been forced to bury their dreams. Beyond the hospital walls, the ripple effects of Jamal's ordeal swelled into a tidal wave. The streets buzzed with voiceless ordinary people who'd once felt powerless, now marching under the banner of his name. In city squares and small-town parks, they gathered, their signs aloft, their chants echoing through the crisp air, "Justice for Jamal." Among them was Maria, a single mother who'd lost her brother to a similar fate years ago. She clutched a faded photo of him as she walked, her weathered hands trembling with a mix of grief and hope. Jamal's story had cracked open her silence, urging her to speak when she'd once stayed quiet. Then there was Daniel, a shy college student who'd never joined a protest before, his backpack slung over one shoulder as he handed out flyers, his timid voice growing bolder with each step. These weren't just faceless supporters, she were lives touched by the same injustice, their stories weaving into a tapestry of resistance that stretched far beyond Jamal's family. As Jamal's strength returned, so did his fire. One evening, seated at the dinner table with his leg propped on a cushion, the clatter of plates fading into the background, he looked across at his father. The room was warm, the scent of roasted chicken lingering in the air, but his mind was elsewhere, in the crowds outside, the letters piling up, the voices calling his name. "Dad," he said, his tone soft yet resolute, "I can't just sit here anymore. I don't want to be just a story people tell. I want to do something real." His father's gaze met his, pride swelling in his chest like a rising tide, but worry shadowed his eyes. He saw the boy who'd nearly been lost to him, now a young man ready to carry a nation's hopes. "You've already done so much, son," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "But this fight, it's dangerous, and it's long. We'll face it together, I promise." In that moment, Jamal felt the weight of his purpose settle into his bones, not just to heal, but to ignite a future where no child would know the terror he'd endured. The movement grew louder, a symphony of defiance reverberating across the land. Protests flared in neon-lit cities and quiet rural towns alike, candlelit vigils casting flickering glows on tear-streaked faces. Jamal's name became a rallying cry, his image a beacon on posters and screens. But it was his message that cut deepest. Fear and prejudice had no place in a just world. Lawmakers, spurred by the uproar, scrambled into action. A task force emerged, its members poring over dusty policies in dimly lit offices, unearthing the roots of racial profiling and unchecked force. The Department of Justice launched sweeping inquiries, their investigators fanning out to precincts where accountability had long been a stranger. New laws sprouted in state houses, promising transparency and oversight. each signature a small victory in a war far from won. Yet resistance loomed like a gathering storm. In polished boardrooms and smoky backrooms, skeptics dug in their heels. A grizzled police chief, his medals glinting under fluorescent lights, argued that officers were merely doing their duty, that change would unravel order. A politician, his tie loosened after a long day, dismissed Jamal's ordeal as a tragic fluke, his words dripping with condescension. To them, justice was a machine that hummed along until it didn't, and even then, they'd rather oil its gears than rebuild it. But Jamal's voice, amplified by a chorus of the unheard, pierced through their defenses. His story wasn't a lone thread, it was a web, connecting countless lives shattered by a system that prized power over people. The lesson was clear: abuse that power, and the consequences would ripple far beyond one trigger pull. For Collins, the fallout was a solitary exile. Neighbors who once nodded hello now averted their eyes as he shuffled past, his shoulders hunched against the chill of their judgment. The badge he'd worn with pride was gone, but the guilt was a heavier chain. He'd sit for hours on his sagging couch, staring at the muted TV, wondering if he could have paused, listened, seen Jamal as a boy, not a threat. Justice had found him not in a courtroom, but in the quiet, crushing realization that his actions had fueled a reckoning he couldn't outrun. Jamal pressed on, his voice rising above the fray. From podiums and porches, he spoke of education, of opportunity, of a world where skin didn't dictate survival. Each word was a seed, taking root in hearts across oceans, his scars visible and hidden, a testament to resilience. The road was jagged, the battles relentless, but he walked it with a certainty that change wasn't just a dream, it was a promise he'd fight to keep. And in his wake, a nation stirred, its eyes opening to the cost of power misused and the enduring power of one voice demanding justice. On a crisp autumn evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in hues of amber and gold, Jamal stood at the edge of a sprawling field, the air buzzing with the energy of thousands who had gathered before him. His heart thudded in his chest, a rhythm that echoed both the pain of his past and the hope he now carried like a torch. Once a boy overlooked by a world too busy to care, he had become something far greater, a voice that reverberated not just through the streets of his small American town but across oceans, reaching ears that had long been deaf to the cries of the marginalized. The scars etched into his skin had faded over time, their jagged lines softened by months of healing, but the deeper wound ones carved into his soul remained raw, a constant reminder of the injustice that had nearly stolen his life. Yet, within that ache, Jamal had discovered a purpose so fierce it propelled him forward, even when exhaustion threatened to drag him under. Years ago, he had been just another face in the crowd, a child navigating a world that seemed stacked against him. That all changed on a day now seared into his Memorial Day, when the sharp crack of a gunshot had torn through the quiet of his neighborhood, leaving him crumpled on the pavement, blood pooling beneath him. The pain had been blinding, but it was the betrayal that stung deeper. A system meant to protect him had instead turned its back, leaving him to bleed while onlookers whispered and stared. In the hospital, as machines beeped and his mother wept silently by his bedside, Jamal's mind churned with a storm of emotions, anger at the officer who pulled the trigger, fear that this would define him, and a quiet, simmering resolve that this couldn't be the end of his story. He didn't know it then, but that moment of agony would plant the seed for something monumental. As months passed, the world began to shift around him. What started as a single, trembling voice his own grew into a chorus that swelled across cities and borders. Protests erupted like wildfire, their flames licking at the foundations of a society that had grown complacent in its inequities. Jamal, still a teenager with a slight frame and a mop of curls, became an unlikely figurehead. His brown eyes, once dulled by despair, now burned with a quiet intensity that drew people in. At every rally, every hushed meeting in community centers, he spoke with a clarity that belied his years, his words cutting through the noise like a blade. "This isn't just about me," he'd say, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "It's about all of us who've been pushed aside, told to stay quiet, told our lives don't matter." And the people listened not because he shouted, but because his truth was undeniable. His father, Marcus, stood as a pillar beside him, a man whose own journey mirrored his son's in its complexity. Once a mechanic who spent his days hunched over engines, Marcus had been a quiet soul, his broad shoulders bowed by the weight of raising a black son in a world that too often saw him as a threat. When Jamal was shot, Marcus's world shattered. He'd spent nights pacing the hospital corridors, his calloused hands clenched into fists as he grappled with a father's helplessness. The president of their local union, a gruff but kind-hearted man named Mr. Evans, had been the first to visit, bringing coffee and a promise to stand by them. That promise sparked something in Marcus, a realization that his pain could fuel action. In the months that followed, he shed his silence like an old skin, his deep voice booming at rallies as he demanded reform. "My boy deserved better," he'd roar, tears glistening in his eyes. "Every child does." His anguish had transformed into a clarion call, amplifying Jamal's message and igniting a national reckoning. The movement wasn't just Jamal's anymore, it belonged to the countless others who stepped out of the shadows, their stories weaving a tapestry of shared struggle. There was Leela, a nurse with a gentle smile and tired eyes, who'd tended to Jamal in the ICU and later shared her own tale of losing a brother to police brutality. Her voice trembled as she spoke at a vigil, the flickering candlelight casting shadows across her face, but her resolve was steel. Then there was Darnell, a weary teenager from the next town over, who'd tagged along to protests out of curiosity and found himself pouring his heart into a megaphone, recounting years of being profiled and harassed. These weren't just side characters in Jamal's saga, they were the heartbeat of a revolution, each one a testament to the pervasive rot of a system that had failed them all. Their courage made it impossible to dismiss Jamal's ordeal as a fluke. It was a symptom of a sickness that demanded a cure. The nation watched as policies began to bend under the weight of their collective outcry. Body cameras became mandatory in Jamal's city, a small victory that felt monumental when the mayor signed the bill, his pen trembling slightly under the gaze of a packed council chamber. Community oversight boards sprang up, their meetings packed with citizens like Mrs. Carter, a retired teacher with a sharp tongue and a sharper mind, who'd once taught Jamal and now fought to ensure no other student faced his fate. These changes were slow, painstakingly so, and Jamal often lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling of his bedroom, wondering if it was enough. The fight for justice, he'd come to understand, wasn't a race to a finish line. It was a grueling, endless marathon, each mile marker a hard-won triumph. But every step forward, no matter how tentative, fueled his resolve. He'd think of the faces in the crouched children hoisted on shoulders, the elders nodding solemnly, and feel a flicker of peace amid the storm. On that autumn evening, as Jamal took the podium at the national rally, the weight of his journey pressed against his chest. The field stretched endlessly before him, a sea of faces shimmering under the dying light. Banners waved like sails, their bold letters spelling out demands for equality, accountability, justice. The air crackled with anticipation, a current that seemed to lift the very ground beneath his feet. He gripped the microphone, his palms slick with sweat, and let his gaze sweep over the crowd. For a moment, he saw himself reflected in their eyes, not the broken boy from that blood-soaked street, but a young man forged in fire, unyielding and alive. "Today," he began, his voice cutting through the murmur like a bell, "we stand not just for the change we need, but for the future we deserve. A future where no one has to live in fear, where justice isn't a dream we chase, but a foundation we build." The crowd erupted, a roar that shook the earth and sent birds scattering from nearby trees. Jamal felt it in his bones, a vibration that drowned out the echoes of his doubts. His father stood at his side, his weathered face alight with pride, a hand resting on Jamal's shoulder as if to anchor him. Marcus had become more than a supporter, was a partner in this fight, his own scars a map of their shared resilience. As Jamal spoke, he thought of the lessons etched into every moment of this journey, that power unchecked breeds tyranny, that justice delayed is a wound reopened, and that true change begins when the silenced find their song. His words wove through the air, stirring the hope and rage and sorrow of everyone present into a single, unstoppable force. As the sun slipped fully below the horizon, casting the field in a twilight glow, Jamal stepped down from the stage, his father's hand warm in his own. The crowd began to thin, voices fading into the dusk, but the energy lingered, a promise that this was only the beginning. They walked together, father and son, their shadows stretching long across the grass. Jamal's future, once a fog of uncertainty, now shimmered with possibility. He was no longer just a victim of a broken system, was a leader, a spark that had set ablaze a movement far bigger than himself. The road ahead was daunting, twisting through years of struggle yet to come, but for the first time, he wasn't afraid. The fight for justice had taught him its deepest truth. When power is abused, it sows the seeds of its own undoing, and from those ruins, a stronger world can raise its own voice. One story, one step at a time.